Hi there, and welcome to the video. In this video we're going to be looking at the naming conventions that are potentially used within your working environment. For home and lab networks this doesn't really matter too much if you're only running one or two servers. You can keep quite a simple naming convention. However, when you start to approach larger networks, it's important to have a consistent naming convention across the board so that you can easily identify any device or server or appliance on the network. So in the previous videos we've looked at installing Windows Server 2019 and also Windows 10 as an operating system, and we've left them with the default names during the installation. You aren't prompted during this point as it's assumed that you'll configure those post-installation before migrating to any additional roles on the server. So before we go into the actual roles and features that we may or may not need to deploy in each individual server, we're going to look at this naming convention. If we take a look at the Windows 2019 server and we click on File Explorer at the bottom here, and then we right click on this PC and click on Properties, what you will find is the name that has been assigned to this machine during the installation is Win-, followed by these letters and numbers. And we can change the settings here when we click on that, and we can see the full computer name and the work group, and we can click on Change to change this name. This is also the case with the Windows 10 operating system. So if we go to our Windows 10 machine, we can click on File Explorer at the bottom here. We can right click on this PC and go to Properties. And then from this point, we can see device name. And again, this is called Desktop Dash, followed by some random characters. And we can click on Rename this PC, and it'll ask us to follow through the wizard to put the new name in. When we start to look at the naming convention we use, typically you will name the server after the role or feature that it's predominantly used for. In smaller environments you may have multiple roles or features, but as you grow and add more servers and devices into the network, you'll start to segregate these out further. If we take a look at the following, we can see some very simple server roles just here. We've got DC for domain controller, file servers typically go after file, web servers typically web, sometimes IIS depending on the operating system, remote desktop server, RDS, previously TS or terminal servers. You are limited by a few factors with the Microsoft naming convention. Typically 15 characters was the normal maximum length based on a previous NetBEUI naming convention. You can now go above that on newer operating systems such as Windows Server 2019 and Windows 10. However, any resources that are needed that use the old NetBEUI naming convention will only be able to see the first 15. For that reason, typically it's an idea to keep them below 15. So looking at the roles that we have here, we can see domain controller can be abbreviated to DC, and then if we introduce more, we can add a numerical character to that, such as 1, 2, 3. Same for file server, web servers, and remote desktop services in this example. And this works fine in small single site environments, perhaps at a head office. If we click on next tab here, you'll see that in the example case below we've got a head office, and we have DC1, DC2, file 1, and then we have 3 web servers, or IIS1, IIS2, and IIS3. Unfortunately, these naming conventions as they stand don't really tell us much more than the role. And again, as you start to expand this into a larger network, you may have to quickly identify whether a machine is in production or in development or staging networks, whether it's a physical or virtual server, and also geographical location if it's either large country or perhaps multi-European or worldwide, as the case may be. So as we go through each of these, we're going to see how we can build a standard naming convention. Of course, these can be modified. There is no set standard, but there is good practices that we should stick to. So if we look at the next one across here for the single site with an environment identifier, we can add an extra character in. So in the case of the head office example, we now have PDC1 and PDC2, and that will indicate that it's a production server. As we go further down, we can see the environment just at the bottom here, and we can see we have 2 servers which are for development, so we have DIIS1 and DIIS2. You can go a stage further to this and also add staging and or testing as well. But the principal idea here is that you can now identify whether it's a production or development machine. As we grow in size again, we might want to know the actual type of the server. So this might be a physical server or a virtual server. So again, in the case of the head office, we can add an additional character in, and we can go PPDC1 and PPDC2, and then we can also go down to the virtual servers at the bottom here, which will be VDIIS1 and VDIIS2. So these characters now represent that it's a physical machine or a virtual machine. They also recognize whether it's a production or a test development server, and then they identify the role as well as the number in the numerical order. And this starts to pad out a little bit more. The next stage, typically I'll look to add the operating system, so we can find out the actual operating system that's installed at a quick glance. Typically, most small businesses will be running a Microsoft heavy environment, so typically M for Microsoft or W for Windows, and then as we go further down you might start to expand into, with the virtual networks, Linux servers such as ESXi, and you'll mark that with a different character. In this case we've gone for L. So now what we can tell is we have a Windows, we have a physical server, we have a production server, and it's a domain controller and it's number 1. We have a Windows server again, we know that it's physical and it's in production, and we have DC2, and this follows down for file and web servers as well. For the Linux servers, and again this can be amended to the network that you're working within, but typically L for Linux based, and you might go for L for Linux and then P for physical, and then ESXi in this example 1 and 2, and that will give us a quick indicator of the operating system. Now we have a fairly good breakdown for a single site. We can start looking at actual geographical locations. So as the company expands, or as it may be built already, you may have a site in London, you may have one in Manchester. So we're going to look to add the city location. So in this particular example, we're going to take the head office as London, and we're going to take a remote office as Manchester. So what we've done here, we've added a 3-character identifier for the city. And as you can see at the beginning here, we've got LND for London, and we also have MAN for Manchester. There'll be some links in the description. There are some predefined ISO standards that set not only city but country codes as well, and typically they're viewed as the standard, if you will. So if you're going to introduce these additional city and geographical locations or country locations, it's a good idea to maintain that naming convention, and as I say, the links will be in the description. So in these examples here, what we have now is a London server which is running Windows, as we can be identified by the W. We know that it is a physical server, and we know that it is in production, and we now also know that it's a domain controller, either 1 or 2, and in the case of file 1 and IIS1 as well. For Manchester, we can see that we have a location of Manchester. We know that it's a Windows, we know that it's physical, and we know that it's production DC1. And right at the bottom we can take a Linux example of a Manchester location, Linux operating system, production environment, and then we have ESXi 1. Obviously the numerical identifiers will increase the more that we introduce at that location, depending on the size. Finally, we look at the actual country code. So this will be more international based companies. As we can see here, we've taken a few examples. We've still got the head office in London, and that will be in GB, Great Britain, or UK, United Kingdom. We can also see that we've got US LAX and also New Zealand Belfast just down the bottom here. So as we take a look at this first line across the top, we can see that this server is in Great Britain. It's based in London as the city. It's a Windows server, it's a production server, it's a physical server, and it's domain controller 1, and the exact same for the secondary, except that's DC2. This helps keeping the names to be unique which is obviously something that we need to consider as we build these networks out. You can't have multiple names of the same names on the network, so by expanding it out in a logical manner, it allows us to incrementally increase with the numerical identifier. In the case of the Manchester site here, we have GB again, just for Great Britain or United Kingdom. We have man for Manchester, Windows server, physical, production, DC1. And then we can look at the secondary countries that we've put in, expanding outside of the UK, and we can go for US, LAX for the location, so we now have country and city. We know that's a Windows server, physical server, it's a production server, and it's DC1 for the actual role that it performs. And if we take the example down the bottom here, we can say that New Zealand has some different servers here which are web servers for an example. So we've got NZ for New Zealand, BEL for Belfast, W for Windows. This one will be a virtualized server represented by the V. We know that this is a development server represented by D here, and then we know that this is an IIS or web server, in this case number 1. And this is typically how I'll look to build out any network starting from the beginning. If you start with similar roles that we started with at the beginning, just with the single site, you can see that this will easily get confusing as you add in a second site, and you fail to maintain a consistent naming convention across the board. So by having a clear thought out process before we begin, we can identify servers quickly and easily at a glance. And this becomes, as I say, much more valuable the larger the network, in case you have to search for all Microsoft production servers or Linux development servers, or perhaps just web servers as a whole if there's a security update required. If we go to our naming convention just here, this is more of a visual representation, and again these links will be in the description. But what we can see here is we've got our 1 to 15 characters, which is the old NetBEUI limitation, and then we've done character representation just here for the character letters, and then we've assigned each of these here. So we know the country code is the first 2 characters, we know the city is the next 3 characters, operating system 6th character, the type of server is the 7th, the environment is the 8th, the role of the server we've allowed up to 4 characters for, and then the numerical identifier we've allowed up to 3 characters for. Again, these can all be amended and adjusted based on the circumstances that you're installing. Once we've planned this out though, and we have a templated guide, we can effectively move on to naming our servers just by character. And what you'll see on the screen now is a full naming convention with the full character details. So we can see that the initial server here is GB, so Great Britain or United Kingdom. We can tell that's within the city of London. We can tell the operating system is a Windows-based system. We can see the type is physical. We can see the environment is physical. And we can see the role here. Now this particular role we've called ADDS, and that's Active Directory Domain Services. Can also be called DC. However, there are situations, again, you might want to use all 4 characters or similar for the full naming convention. That's down to preference on that particular one. However, any identifier that's unique to identify the role, and then obviously we have the numerical identifier, in this case 001. If we then take our next example here, we can see that we have a server located in GB again, or UK. City is London. This operating system is Linux based, so it's represented with the L. Type is production. Type is physical. Environment is production, and the role is ESXi. So we know that's the XE host, and in this case the numerical identifier we have 001, and we can see the next line is 002. So we have 2 there. And as we scroll down, we might find we actually use some fewer letters in some roles, and for that example we'll take the server just here at the end of the line for GB. So we have a GB country code, LND for city. This is a Windows operating system. This is a virtual server. The environment is production, and this is an RDS, which is Remote Desktop Services Server. So we don't use all 15 characters, but we still have our identifiers here for 1 and 2 for those servers. 15 characters being the max. Obviously we try to put as much detail in as possible, but some roles just only require 1, 2, 3, or we've allowed up to 4 characters. Again, you might want to modify this to allow 5 characters for the role and only 2 for the identifier. Again, this is personal preference, but as a starting point, it's just good to understand the limitations and maximums that we can do. Another part to bear in mind is during the naming convention, you will be limited by the Microsoft naming convention with these machines. There are some characters that are also not allowed, such as backslash and forward slash, speech marks, question marks, and also the vertical bar or pipe. So again, as you plan out these, it's typically easier in the long term to maintain either characters and numbers only, or very few characters that are allowed. Again, personal preference, and as you build the networks out, you'll be able to decide this as you go along. And in a home test dev environment, you can experiment with this to find the best naming convention that works for you and your environment. As we go down, we'll take one more example here, and in this case we're going to take New Zealand, Belfast. So NZ for New Zealand, BEL for Belfast. We know that this is a Windows operating system. This is a virtual server represented by the V. Environment is T, so we know this is a test. So as opposed to D for development, this is actually a test server. And then this is meant to be an IIS server for web servers, and then 001. I've actually made a typo here, so I'll amend that now. And for this particular example, what we're looking at here is that we have some test servers, we have some development servers, and we also have some staging servers. So in a larger environment, you may have the test servers just for user testing in the first instance. You may have the staging servers prior to going into production. And again, these can all be thought out in advance. So based on the character being allowed for the environment, you can assign whatever you may be. And in some instances, there are people that have used, or there are standards that have used country codes and city codes as numbers as opposed to letters. Again, on a quick visual representation, I typically find the letters are easier. However, there are industries out there that particularly work on numbers, so you might find that country codes and city codes are numbers, and that may work better in your actual environment. Once you've decided upon your naming convention, as I say, these are examples here for different types of servers. In this case, we have domain controllers, ESXi hosts, files, and web servers. We've also gone for appliance servers as well, and you'll see this one here is an appliance server for the vCenter as an example. As we move along, we can apply these same naming conventions to the infrastructure as well. So in this particular instance at the top here, we have the exact same identifiers for the top, except in this case we've changed the role to represent what the infrastructure device is. In this case I'm referring to switches and firewalls. Some of these might be physical, some of these might be virtual or appliances, and you can name them accordingly. In this particular instance, I've changed character 6 to be a vendor, so we can see that if we take this first example, we have GB as the country code, LND as the city code, vendor C, in this case that would represent a Cisco device, type is physical, environment is production, and CSWI would represent a core switch, and numerical identifier 001. Obviously, as it's a core switch, we'll have a level of redundancy, so we also have CSWI 002 as another core switch. This applies also as we go further down. We might have some access switches, so we just change the characters, ASWI for both of those examples. Actually, we have 3 examples just there for access port switches. And then we can go down to virtual appliances such as firewalls, which we may have in there as well, depending on the type of environment and the type of deployment that you're using. We can also, in this example, we've used UPSs for uninterruptible power supplies. Now, whilst you may not be able to name the actual device with a host name, typically within the environment you will be able to assign a DNS record so that you don't have to remember IP addresses for all of these individual devices. And we'll go into IP addresses and subnetting and how to assign that in another video. However, it's important to understand that it's easier to remember a naming convention usually than it is to remember multiple IP addresses, especially as you expand across multiple sites and subnets and different IP addresses. And again, as we go down, we can see that we've just changed the country codes and the city codes here where needed. In this case, New Zealand, Belfast again. Once again though, this is the infrastructure naming. We then can take this and apply this also to our endpoint naming convention. And as we go over here, we can see that what we've done here along the top, typically the the need to identify the role of it, of a device, is much less important when it comes to the endpoints. And we're typically talking about desktops or laptops, or perhaps in some situations you have physical wires servers for remote desktop services, etc. So what we've done here is we've used characters 1 and 2 for country code, 3, 4 and 5 for the city, number 6 is the OS, number 7 is the type, and that would be either D for desktop or L for laptop. There are reasons to segregate the two via naming convention, so that you can deploy certain applications to some and not others, or vice versa. For instance, it may be that all your desktops require soft phone deployment, whereas the laptops may be using a different system, or they may be personnel that have mobiles that don't need that particular software deployed. But there are reasons to be able to logically separate the two from a naming convention. The environment, again, these are all production devices, but you might have a couple of test, dev, or staging devices depending on the environment. And then the last characters, 9 through 15, we use as the numerical identifier. Typically, you'll have many more endpoint devices, workstations, desktops and laptops than you will servers. So by having a more numerical based identifier at the end, it allows this to grow. That is pretty much the core fundamentals of any naming convention for servers, services, and endpoints and devices that I typically use within any engagements. Again, these can be modified and changed based on your preference or your needs. There isn't particularly a clear set standard across the board, but it is genuinely accepted depending on the environment that roles and features will dictate the name of the servers. In the description there will be links to the country code and city codes that typically are used, as I say, based on the ISO standards. And then pretty much from there on in, the other identifiers that you use will be down to preference. As I say, from experience, it's nice to be able to find any operating systems of a particular type if there's a vulnerability from a security point of view, or the type of role, so that you can identify if web servers, for instance, need a particular security update. It's nice to be able to identify them from a name as well. So thinking about these in a long term, having a clear naming convention helps when you have that from the beginning, and you can scale out accordingly. Even if you start with a single site, if you give it the full naming convention, then at least it gives you the ability to grow without having to rename or repurpose those machines later on at another time. As I say, in the next few videos, we're going to go through, once the servers and the endpoints are named, we'll be looking at assigning those roles and features, and we'll be looking at deploying the rest of the network. Hope you enjoyed the video.